Hi everyone, and thanks for joining me for another episode of Remakes in Retrospect. And today we are going to check out a beloved 1985 cult classic and its subsequent 2011 remake. Now let's see if today's remake was simply another unoriginal and unnecessary cash grab, or did they manage to get right what so many other remakes ultimately fail at? Was this remake rotten, or was it worthy? On that note, welcome to Den of Horror everyone, or should I say, welcome to Fright Night. Outside of the really cool title, another thing that I feel the original and the remake have in common is that both films were released in years that were, as far as I'm concerned, somewhat unremarkable as far as horror films go. 1985. This year was all about the big sequel. Friday the 13th, The Hills Have Eyes, The Howling all received a second installment. Freddy Krueger himself popped his adorable muggin for round 2 in Freddy's Revenge, which would ultimately become the highest grossing horror movie of that year. 85. Big on sequels, light on original material. Now, of course, there were some good original horror movies released in 1985, like Reanimator and Cat's Eye, but to me, the year felt like it suffered a little bit from a slasher's hangover. But there was one little, unassuming horror movie that would enter the fray and give the genre in 1985 a fighting chance. That's right, fan of horror, you know what I'm talking about. Tom Holland's much beloved Fright Night. Fright Night became the second highest grossing horror movie of that year, behind only Freddy's Revenge, but more significantly, this little film seemed to reinvigorate the entire genre with its brilliant blend of atmosphere, genuine scares, and dark laughs. Now, to be totally honest with you guys, I am still surprised that Fright Night actually got the remake treatment in the first place. I mean, sure, the original was successful, but it always felt to me like a wonderful little oddity of a movie, a cult classic, if you will, rather than a full-blown box office success that now goes and gets a remake behind its name. But then again, maybe I shouldn't be that surprised, because after all, Fright Night is a vampire movie and the remake was released in 2011. Now, for those of you that remember, in 2011, we were all caught in the middle of a massive global vampire frenzy, thanks to a little movie called Twilight and its array of sparkly sequels. However, much like 1985, 2011 was also an unremarkable year for original horror films. Lots of sequels, lots of B-grade gore buckets, and one particular little horror movie that I completely failed to adequately categorize, called I Was a Teenage Werebear. What the fuck? It seemed that not even master filmmaker Francis Ford Coppola could save the day with his weird and obscure horror installment Twixt. But could Colin Farrell's Jerry the Vampire do for 2011 what Chris Sarandon's Jerry the Vampire did for 1985? Jerry the Vampire. I'm never gonna get through this one. And bring the desperately needed fresh and original bite back into the genre. And the story, for those of you who don't know, is about a teenager who discovers that his new next-door neighbor is a vampire and must now do everything in his power to protect his loved ones from a blood-sucky fate. Combining a top-class cast of Anton Yelchin, Toni Colette, David Tennant, and of course the always interesting superstar Colin Farrell, with a promising new director, Craig Gillespie, definitely boded well for the remake. But the best of the good omens for me was the inclusion of Martha Noxon. Now, who is Martha Noxon, I hear you ask? Well, for those of you who don't know, she is the writer behind the Buffy the Vampire Slayer series. Why is this important? Well, it's actually very important because it would mean that the Fright Night remake would get a writer that seemed to understand the contrasting dynamics of horror and comedy, and more importantly, how to blend the two. and this is something that the original Fright Night truly excelled at. So fast forward post-release. Was Fright Night the Remake a good movie? Yes, it was actually. It was a good, tightly paced, fun adventure of a film. Good acting? Check. Good directing? Check. Good script? Check. Ish. We'll get to the script in a few moments. But the film is good with some particularly cool opening touches that the original didn't have. For example, the teenagers that mysteriously start to disappear from the neighborhood once Jerry arrives on the scene, I felt was pretty nifty. Now the remake also elaborates on the antagonist's motivation in a way that I feel was at times unnecessary, but nevertheless very interesting. You see, in the remake, Jerry the vampire is a specific breed of bloodsucker that needs to collect as many victims as he can in order to build up an army of powerful vampires. Now, like I mentioned earlier, I don't know if this addition to Jerry the Vampire was all that necessary. I tend to come from the school of thought that the less you know about the vampire, the better, in most cases. However, this was a respectable, if not interesting, choice. Another mention that I've got to give here is to Anton Yelchin, who sadly passed away in 2016. He brought a wonderful and sincere boy next door kind of charm to the character of Charlie Brewski. Sadly missed activist. So was Fright Night the Remake a good movie? Yes, absolutely. But the big question is, was Fright Night the Remake a good remake? Well, the answer to that question is... Sorry about that. Back to the question. Was Fright Night the Remake a good remake? And the answer to that question is... no. Now, one of the few problems that I have with Fright Night the Remake, and I can't believe I'm actually saying this, is that it's almost too original for its own good. It's like it strays a little bit too far from the source material. At the end of the day, this is Fright Night the Remake. This does have a title that it inevitably has to live up to. And yet I feel that Fright Night the Remake doesn't quite honor its namesake. The 2011 version makes so many significant changes that at times it has only a passing resemblance to the original. It also makes some pretty big changes to two of the original's most beloved characters, namely Peter Vincent, the Vampire Slayer, who in the remake is a completely different character, and also to the film's main antagonist, Jerry the Vampire. Now, in the remake, I can kind of understand why they gave us a more contemporary, sort of updated version of Jerry the Vampire. You know, in the remake, they've almost turned him into a sort of a buffer, sort of Edward Cullen type of character. Now, like I said, I can understand this change, but it's not one that I necessarily like or agree with. I don't know, maybe it's a Gen X thing. Now, granted, a lot of what I've just mentioned can certainly be overlooked because if you haven't seen the original, it's all going to be irrelevant anyway. But something that isn't irrelevant, and where I feel that the remake definitely should have taken a page out of the original's handbook, is in keeping the story patient and simple. The original Fright Night did such a good job of building up the dark mystery surrounding the character of Jerry, and it also took its time in telling us the story, introducing us to the characters. This lured us into the story and immersed us in the world that the story takes place in. The remake makes the mistake of rushing its punches. In the very opening scene of the film, the remake basically shows us that we're dealing with some kind of a supernatural monster. Why in the very opening scene? Why not allow the audience to savor the reveal a little bit more and make that discovery for themselves later on? It's almost as if the remake script doesn't quite trust the original story or the audience's willingness to engage in a story that is told in a more slower, more patient, more mysterious manner, and so compensates for it with a whole lot of quick reveals and unnecessary early gore. Now let's talk about Jerry the Vampire. In the original, Chris Sarandon captured the sultry and dark allure of Christopher Lee's Dracula. In the remake, we have Colin Farrell, who I read was a massive fan of the original and watched the film hundreds of times. He seems to really enjoy playing Jerry the Vampire, and his talent is definitely on good display in this film. However, and there is a small however here, I feel that Colin Farrell kind of pushes it a little bit too far sometimes, and he hams it up a little bit too much, you know? And as you know, fans of horror, I am a man who appreciates the quiet art of subtlety. Okay, maybe I'm being a little bit pushy on the remake because I myself am such a big fan of the original Fright Night. I mean, it's a film that is woven deep into the tapestry of my own youth, like it is for so many others. In fact, let me just make a little admission right here and now. Maybe a lot of what I'm doing here with Den of Horror is in so many ways inspired, and I'm probably a bit of a rip-off, to be honest with you, of Fright Night's Van Helsing-esque Peter Vincent. It is a film that encapsulates so much about what I love about horror and also the vampire mythology. It's like I mentioned earlier, it's this wonderful oddity because it's filled with equal measures of darkness and of horror, and at the same time also heart and humor. It's also tethered to those old movies that I love so much, the old Dracula classics of the 30s and 60s. And yet at the same time, it's practically a paradigm of 80s horror, and that's probably a reason why it's become such a beloved relic of that decade. I feel that the original Fright Night captured the same magical and endearing spark that Joe Dante's Gremlins did a year earlier. So to sum it all up, Fright Night the remake is a good film. It's even a worthy remake, but it just doesn't come with the same bite that the original did. I mean, remaking a successful movie is always going to be difficult, but remaking a beloved cult classic, it's near impossible. Okay, what do you guys think? You guys think I'm being a little bit too hard on the remake? Maybe a little bit too sentimental on the original? Hey, that can certainly be the case. Whatever it is that you think, drop me a comment down below. And listen, if you guys like the content, please feel free to subscribe for more horror content. I've got some more retrospective remakes coming your way, as well as some superior sequels, a few horror gems, and maybe the odd random review. On that note, I wish all of you young and old vampires out there a wonderful, wonderful week. Stay happy, stay healthy, and most of all, stay horror.
I'll say this so that it doesn't.
See you next time for another episode of Den of Horror!